and that is he's willing to come in close contact with a leper. He's willing to touch someone with leprosy. And then, having dealt with this, Jesus moves on and he's willing to help what many Jews would consider the enemy. He's willing to heal the servant of a Roman centurion. Now, the Romans were occupying the land of Palestine. They had conquered God's people, and here they are. And they're viewed very clearly, as any occupying enemy army will be, as the enemy of God's people. But Jesus reaches out and in compassion heals this centurion's servant. And then Jesus talks to some people who seem to be very, very enthusiastic and eager about following him. And he says, well, are you really prepared for what it requires? Are you just talking? Are you just saying what sounds good and not what you really mean? Now, and then Jesus astonishes and slightly frightens the disciples by healing the storm on the lake. He saves their lives. He's asleep. We know from Mark's gospel that Jesus is sleeping in the stern of the boat, his head resting on a pillow. It's a very evocative memory that comes from Peter. And Peter remembers that incident, as all the disciples would, with great clarity and great imagination. So they're crossing the sea. They're going to the region of Gadara. And that's where we pick it up in verse 28. Now, Gadara was on the other side of the lake, and it was very largely a Gentile area. Jews did not live in Gadara, or if they lived there, there were very, very few of them. So Gadara was foreign country to Jesus and the disciples, and I'm sure the disciples wondered why he was going there. So we pick it up there. Now, again, this is showing the breadth of Jesus' ministry. It's not parochial. It's not confined to the Jews. It's not confined to a small area. Here is Jesus reaching out with a love and a compassion and a concern for Jews and Gentiles. And Matthew's gospel, though it is the most Jewish of gospels, is showing the breadth of Jesus' ministry. Now, let's pick it up at verse 28. When he arrived at the other side of the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they said. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off and went into the town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus. When they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. Now, Matthew handles this story in a different way and with different details than the other Gospels. For instance, he says there were 2 men who were demon-possessed. The other Gospels only mention 1 man, and Luke gives us his name, Legion. Now, it's fair to say that on some of these stories, Matthew tends to paint with a large brush. He's not necessarily as detailed-oriented as, for instance, Luke is in his Gospel. Remember, Luke, at the very beginning of his Gospel, makes a promise to someone he calls Theophilus, we believe was a Roman official who wanted to know the facts about Jesus. And so Luke decides he's going to become the Joe Friday of the first century. He's going to give Theophilus the facts. And he says, he makes a promise. He says, "I've done my homework. I've interviewed the eyewitnesses. I've discarded the stories that are dubious and secondhand and not really accurate, and I'm presenting before you an orderly, accurate account of Jesus' ministry. And so Luke is very, very reliable, as well as writing the most elegant Greek in the New Testament. But Luke tells us there was one man. Now, that doesn't mean there was not a second one. It just means he doesn't feature. You know, when Luke interviews an eyewitness, when Luke talks to someone about they remember the man called Legion. So it's not a contradiction, but it's simply a discrepancy. In one says there was two. Now again, Matthew adds and he subtracts because he gives us two people, but he doesn't give us the names of either of them. Luke gives us one person and gives us the names. And you find it in Luke 8:26. That happens in other stories. If you think about it, think of the last time that Jesus passes through Jericho and is going to Jerusalem on his last visit. He's going to be arrested. It's coming up to the last week of Jesus' life, and he goes through Jericho. Now, some of the Gospels talk about two blind beggars, but again, we focus on one of them called Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus, who Jesus is passing through the town of Jericho, and he calls out for Jesus to help him, to cure him, and to heal him. So, now, what we have here is something that I would say almost all of us have no experience with whatsoever, and that's demon possession. It is not something we're familiar with. It's something outside our sort of understanding, but it is something that was real and something that is real now. You experience, if you talk to missionaries who've been in places like India and Africa and so on, they come upon it much more than we imagine. So here is Jesus healing these two people, restoring them to health. The man in Luke's gospel who's called Legion, it's very significant that he has that particular name. And you see this strange interplay between Jesus and the demons recognizing Jesus, knowing that he is the Son of God, knowing who he is. It's very significant. Isn't it odd that the Jewish leaders who've had 1,000 years of God's word and God's leadership and be God's chosen people, they fail to recognize the Messiah for whom they've prayed and hoped and waited for centuries. They don't recognize Jesus, but these demons recognize who Jesus is. I think that's very, very suggestive. Now, Jesus heals this man, these two men, and sends these demons into the pigs, and the pigs run racing down the slope into the lake and are drowned. Notice the last bit, verse 34, then the whole town went out to meet Jesus. Now, remember, these two men have been a demon in the district. You couldn't go anywhere near there. People were frightened of them. Again, in Luke's, it tells us that this man, Legion, they had tried to put him under control. They had bound him with chains. He had broken the chains. He was the crazy man in the area who you warned your kids about, and you didn't go anywhere near there. And yet, the people coming out don't say, well, that's wonderful, Jesus. You've cleared up this local problem. They just say to Jesus, we'd like you to leave. They urge Jesus, they plead with him to leave their region. So it's a very strange story for us. And in the other Gospels, there's a different order of some of these things, because in the other Gospels, right after this, they go back, and the first to their own side of the lake. And the first person they encounter, Jesus encounters, is Jairus, whose daughter is desperately ill. We'll meet her a little bit later in the account. So let's pick it up at Matthew 9. Does anyone have any questions about the demon possession or what we see in these last verses? Yeah. Okay, let's pick it up at Matthew 9. Jesus stepped into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own town. Some men brought to him a paralytic lying on a mat. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven you." At this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming." Knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, "Why do you entertain evil thoughts in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "Get up, take up your mat, and go home." And the man got up and went home. And when the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe, and they praised God who had given such authority to men. Okay, what's missing in that story? Does it sound very familiar? What's missing? What do we always associate with this story? What are we used to reading more detail in this story from the other Gospels? What's the missing bit? The bit that always intrigues us. Yes, Bob? The business of the friends not being able to get to the house, going up onto the roof, taking the tiles off the roof, lowering their friend to the feet of Jesus. Isn't that what's missing? Because we're almost word for word, it's exactly the same story. Again, Jesus doesn't praise the man for his faith, even in Matthew's account. Who does he praise? Look at it again. He praises the friends. Look at the opening word of chapter 2, verse 2. Some men brought to him a paralytic lying on a mat. When Jesus saw what? Their faith. He said to the paralytic. He doesn't say to the paralytic, I admire your faith, Buster. Doesn't say that. He praises the faith of the men who said, if we only could get our buddy to Jesus, he will cure him. That's where the faith comes in. This man is kind of like I don't want to say he's unwilling, but he's not adding very much to the situation, is he? He's just there. So there we go. So that's what's missing in this story. We saw in the other accounts, Matthew gives us the details, but he doesn't give us the location. He misses what, as we've said, what is for most of us the most striking aspect of the story, the faith and the ingenuity of the friends. Think about it. You know, the fact that they were not deflected, they were not put off, they did not say, look, we gave it a good try, but you can't get anywhere near, the crowds are mobbing around the house, we can't get anywhere near, we'd love to get them right to Jesus, but that's just not possible. So they thought what? Outside the box. Don't you love the box? Yes, Randy, you look like you're about to ask a very important and theological question.
I don't know whether this is inside or outside. Anyway, is there an implication here that sins cause the man's paralysis?
None. Randy's asking, is there any implication that the sins cause... Well, it depends what way you're asking it, Randy. If you're asking it as a general principle, do sins cause sickness? The answer is no. The Bible is very clear on that point. But there are certain modes of behavior that cause trouble. Have you ever known someone who ended up in a wheelchair because they drove a car when they were drunk? or somebody who something happened to them because they were under the influence of drugs, or somebody who had an ongoing illness because it was a sexually transmitted diseases. Let me finish. Behavior can result in consequences. Those are specifics. If you mean it in the broader sense, are we punished by sickness by God for things we have done? I think the answer broadly is no. Okay, what's your supplementary? Well, yes, but bear in mind, Randy, Jesus is looking into the face of this man, and as only Jesus can. He's looking into the heart of this man. He knows, Jesus alone knows why this man is paralyzed. The friends may not know, his family may not know, but Jesus knows. And so therefore he answers, he says something, and there are such things. I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but a minister that I knew went to a small parish in Wales. And this man had been a medical doctor before he went into ministry. And he wasn't there very long when a local doctor asked him to come and examine. There were two sisters who lived together in the town. I'm sure there were more than two sisters, but this particular case. And one of the sisters was in a wheelchair. And the local doctor said to the new minister, who had been a doctor, he said, I'd like you to examine her. I not want you to go as a minister. I want you to go as a former doctor. I want you to examine her, and I want you to give me your opinion. So they had a nice visit. He asked if he could examine her. He did so, and all the rest of it. Put her through a number of tests, and they left the house. And as they were walking back down the road, the new minister said, there's not a thing wrong with her. There's no reason whatsoever why she's in that wheelchair. It was one of those psychosomatic illnesses. And the two sisters began to attend the new minister's church, and at a little point along the road, the sister in the wheelchair made a profession of faith, and about 2 weeks after that, the wheelchair was put away, never mentioned again, and she walked and lived the rest of her life like a person who had always been able to walk. It was a psychosomatic situation. You don't know, but Jesus knew. Jesus knew the origin of why he was paralyzed in a way that we don't. So Jesus heals this man, and you see immediately the critics gather around and say, well, this fellow is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God? What they didn't realize was they were being exactly correct. Here was God in human flesh standing before them, forgiving the sins of this man. And Jesus says, well, okay, which is it easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say to a paralyzed man, get up and walk? Anyone can say your sins are forgiven because you don't know if that's happened, and they don't know if it's happened, and no one else can witness it or confirm it or whatever. And Jesus puts that to the test, and he proves it. So here this man gets up. Look at verse 8. When the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe, and they praised God who had given such authority to men. Now, here's another extraordinary thing that Jesus does, which is unacceptable, bound to make some of the disciples feel uneasy. This business of reaching out to people beyond the nation of Israel, and being willing to help people. Now, Matthew is a striking example of this. Here he is. His proper name is Levi. So he's a Jew. He's working for the Roman government. He's Levi, son of Alphaeus. We know again from Luke's gospel, because of Luke has tracked down, well, what is his real name? What is his given name? He becomes Matthew, but what's his real name? His real name is Levi, son of Alphaeus. We know his father's name, and so his family, and so on. Now, here is a man who was willing to work for the Roman government. Can you guess why? Money. He was willing to have no friends. He was willing to be thought of as a traitor. He was willing to be considered a traitor to his religion, to his race. But he was going to make a lot of money. And that's what he was willing to do. He was a collaborator. I spoke to someone one time at a party, and I said to him, "What do you do?" And he said to me, "Well, I'm a civil servant." I said, "Okay." Yeah, I never thought any more about it. We went on talking. And he said to me, he asked me what I did. And I said, "I buy Heather shoes." No, I didn't say that. But, you know, we talked a little bit further. And finally he said to me, "Pastor," he said, "I have to be honest with you." He said, "I never tell this to people because it's a conversational killer." He said, "I work for the IRS." And he said, if you say that at a dinner party, you say that at a social gathering, you know, people are looking at you, they start to move away from you. If you ask them their name, they think they're going to be audited. He said it's just an absolute killer. So I just say I'm a civil servant. And here is this man working for the Roman government. Now, here's how much these people, these collaborators, were despised. Firstly, their money was tainted. They couldn't give their money to the local synagogue knowingly. It wouldn't be accepted. They couldn't put their money in the temple. Again, knowingly, it was tainted. Secondly, they couldn't give evidence in court. Their testimony was dismissed. Because if they were willing to do this, the assumption was they were perfectly willing and capable of lying. So they're absolute social, political lepers. And they're only in it for the money. They're willing to work for the government. Now, here's the way that it worked was that you actually tendered to be a local tax collector for the Romans. And if the Romans wanted 10% on goods and you could squeeze 12% or 15% from the local people, you got to keep the rest. This was considered the perks of the job. And you had all the power and all the might of Rome behind you. Someone didn't pay, you just called a Roman soldier, they were taken off to prison. So you got to keep the rest of the money, whatever you could get out of people. And so here is a man who is really, really unpopular, unwelcome. Verse 9, as Jesus went from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Now, was it as quick as that? We saw Jesus touch the leper who was ceremonially unclean. A man like Levi was culturally and socially unclean. And so it was just unimaginable that Jesus would recruit this man, that he would be not only, the assumption is, well, Jesus wouldn't have anything to do with this man, but he not only calls him, but he calls him into the band. "Follow me." Now think of it for Matthew. This was a life-changing moment. And he did exactly what Jesus told him. He followed him. He took Jesus at his word. Jesus did it then. Jesus can do it today. There are people who have a sudden, dramatic conversion. Now, not to take away from that, but I'm just ministerial experience. I have known people who've had a sudden conversion, but when you get to talk to them afterwards, when you get to know them down the line, maybe as their pastor or as their friend, you discover that there was a seed or several seeds planted in the past. unknown, maybe unnoticed. You discovered a mother or father, a godly mother or father praying for that son, for that daughter, that they would come to faith. You find an influence from a family member, a pastor, a Sunday school teacher, someone who was always praying for the conversion of that person. That doesn't take away from the suddenness of the conversion, because they have to make that decision in their head. But it does talk about there being things behind the scenes that you were not aware of and they were not aware of. But suddenly it all comes together. Suddenly it all gels. Suddenly he finds Jesus. He hears Jesus. Has he heard Jesus before? Has he listened to Jesus before? We don't know. We're not told. But he makes a completely clean break. And he seems to have, look at verse 10, he's hosting a dinner party for his tax collector buddies. It's a sort of meet Jesus meal they have together. Verse 10, because he thinks to himself, well, if anybody needs salvation, if anyone needs forgiveness, it's my friends who also work for the Roman government. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, think about Matthew. Matthew goes off to open his tax booth that day with no idea, no thought, no imagination that this was going to be his last day working for the Roman government. Before the day is over, Jesus has spoken to him. He has responded. He closes the books. He shuts up the booth, and off he goes, following Jesus. And he decides to have a farewell dinner. Think about it. Here's a man who went. When you realize this is his gospel that you're reading, here's a man who went from writing in the ledgers for the Roman government, the taxes paid on this, the amount due from that person. He went from that, from being an accountant for the Romans, to writing an account of the life of Jesus, which has been read by millions of people in the last 2,000 years. Think of that. It's quite a switch, isn't it? And so he gets together all his friends. He gets together all, you might as well say it, all the reprobates, all the undesirables, all the dregs of society. They share a meal. Now, in the East, sharing a meal with someone meant a great deal more than it means for us. It spoke about intimacy. It spoke about friendship. It spoke about commitment. When you broke bread with someone, it meant that there was a bond between you. And you notice when Jesus responds to the criticism, he quotes Hosea 6:1. This is what Hosea 6:6. This is what it says. God declares, this is God speaking through the prophet Hosea, God declares, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Now here's what you have to understand. Hosea and Amos and Joel were what were called in the Old Testament, what the scholars called the 8th century ethical prophets. Now that's important because firstly, they were prophesying to the children of Israel 800 years before Jesus. And by that stage, the Jews' faith had become formalized and rigid, and they had grown up this idea that as long as you appeased God, by offering the right sacrifices, by doing the right thing, you could behave any way you wanted. You could cheat, you could lie. If you were a judge, you could take bribes. If you were an official, you could be corrupt. And so the 8th century prophets like Amos and Hosea and so on, they said, look, God's just not interested in burnt offerings. He's interested in justice. He's interested in you taking care of the poor, looking after the widows, living a life of integrity, living a life of honesty and justice, feeding the hungry. Now this sounds obvious to us, but it wasn't obvious 8 centuries before Jesus. And these prophets like Amos and Hosea were trying to teach the Jews that belief must match behavior. That you can't say you believe in God and then you do whatever you like. You be as corrupt, as crooked, as dishonest, as uncaring, as uncompassionate as you possibly can, and say, well, God is happy with me because I went to the temple the other day and I offered the following sacrifice. That was a new thing for the Jews, that there was a connection, that here was faith in action, that it was not just formalized, empty faith that never reached the heart. And these 8th century prophets, they're all now in what we now call the minor prophets. And the only reason they're called the minor prophets in the Bible is because their books, like Amos and Hosea and Joel and so on, they're all much smaller than the big prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on. So that's why they're called the minor prophets. Now, Luke tells us that Jesus was a guest of honor at this feast in Matthew's home. And Jesus tells these critics that he is the spiritual physician, that he is the doctor of men's souls. And he says, I go where the need is greatest. I go where I'm needed. Now, right on top of this criticism by the teachers of the law, Jesus seems to be criticized. If you look at verse 14 and 15, Jesus seems to be being criticized by the followers of John the Baptist. Now, John had his disciples. He had his followers. He had those who went with him. And they had clearly been watching Jesus and the disciples and watching what they did and what they didn't do. Now, it's fair to say that at this point, John the Baptist himself was in prison. He had been arrested by Herod, one of the sons of Herod the Great, and he had criticized Herod for his adulterous relationship with his brother's wife. And John the Baptist was going around the countryside telling everyone how bad this was and what a scoundrel Herod was. And Herod decided he couldn't listen to this anymore, so he had John arrested and confined within the prison under the palace where Herod lived. But here's the followers of Jesus, the followers of John, and they come to Jesus with their criticism. Listen to what they say. Then John's disciples came and asked, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Now, in the Old Testament, as I told you before, in the Old Testament, the Jews were only required to fast once a year on the Day of Atonement. Now, where that changed was during the time, if you read the first chapter of the book of Daniel, you hear about how the Babylonians came, they invaded Jerusalem, they took the people captive. In fact, they invade Jerusalem on 3 separate occasions. And the first time they take the young people and the bright and the brilliant and the beautiful, and they take them back to indoctrinate them. Then they come back again. They take more people as slaves, and they come back a third time, and so on. But the point is that thousands and thousands of Jews are in Babylon as slaves in that foreign land. And while they're there, they start to think, well, maybe we should be fasting more than once a year. Maybe God would be pleased with us. Maybe God would return us to our native land if we connected with God through our fasting program. And so there began to be this idea. Now, during this time of Jesus, the Pharisees fasted on average twice a week. So they go from once a year to twice a week. And fasting became sort of the benchmark of their spiritual life in the eyes of the Pharisees. It's one of the things they would measure you. Well, how often do you fast? And if you said twice a week, they would be very impressed. If you said 3 times a week, they'd think you were even more spiritual than you were. So that's where the whole idea of fasting comes in. And this is why John's followers ask him, why do you not fast? Why don't you teach your disciples to fast? Because clearly John had taught his followers to fast. But Jesus had not done this. Now, Jesus gives an answer which is very clear, but very dependent upon you understanding what a wedding in Palestine was like. So let's read it first. How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. Now let's just stop at that point. Jesus is giving, and it's very subtle, and I'm sure all the disciples missed it. He's giving a subtle warning to his disciples to indicate that he won't be around forever. That there will be a point where he, the bridegroom, will no longer be with them. And this was something they couldn't imagine. It's something they didn't even want to think about. Because you may remember that in Mark's Gospel, Jesus tells the disciples on 3 separate occasions in 3 different places that he is going to Jerusalem, he is going to suffer and die, he is going to go down into the grave, and he's going to rise the 3rd day. He tells them that, and they just blank this out. They just say, oh, he's just being pessimistic. You know, when he's saying he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested, the authorities are going to put him on trial, and so on. They completely blank it out. Now, in Palestine, a wedding was different culturally than how it is here. There was a wonderful procession where almost the whole village would join in the procession, and the bridegroom would go to his bride's family home and get his bride and her bridesmaids, and then they would process, and then there would be the ceremony, and then they would have the wedding feast and so on. Well, nobody went on honeymoon. There was no honeymoon. The bride and groom became the king and queen of the feast. And the feast would go on for days, and they had to stay. They had to be there. They were there because some guests arrived early, some guests arrived late, some guests had a farm. They couldn't leave the animals. They would come the next day and all this kind of. So it went on for a number of days. If you read the life of Samson, you discover that Samson's wedding feast lasted for a week. So it was a very different sort of thing. The bride and groom were the guests of honor. And while they were there, the celebration was just over the top. It was just wonderful. Now, Jesus is describing himself as the groom, because the nation of Israel in the Old Testament is called God's bride. So if the whole nation of Israel collectively is God's bride, here is God's bridegroom. Here is the coming together. Here is the marriage, and so on. If you look up Isaiah 62 and verse 5, you'll find one of the passages that talks about Israel being the bride of God. And so the Son of God, as Jesus describes himself, the Son of God, Son of Man, comes as the groom. Now, you always hear at memorial services Ecclesiastes chapter 3 read, where it talks about there's a time for everything, a season under heaven for everything, a time to weep, a time to work, a time to not work, and all this kind of thing. So Jesus says, look, there's no time for fasting because my time is short, and I'm the bridegroom and I'm here with my people, but there's going to come a time when I'll be taken away, when the joyfulness will be over, when it will be time for sorrow, with my arrest, with my execution. And then there will be a time, 3 days later, a time of joy again. The whole image is of the bridegroom being taken away. Nobody fasts. And that was one of the cultural things, was that even fasting was put on one side. If you're having a wedding feast and it was going to be this week, there was no fasting this week. You had the celebration, you had the joy, you had the food, you had the wine, you had the getting together. All of that was fundamental. All of that was paramount. It took precedent over fasting. And Jesus is saying, this is the time. This is the wedding breakfast. Now, he goes on, well, maybe we're very short of time. Maybe we'll leave the paradox between how Jesus describes the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. By the way, testament just means covenant. The Old Agreement, we call it the Old Testament, the New Testament. It refers to the Old Covenant, the Old Agreement between God and man, and the New Covenant between God and man through Jesus Christ. That's what the word covenant means. It means testament or agreement or arrangement. That's what it means. Does anyone have any questions? Well, we'll just stop at that because we'll pick it up about at verse 16 next time. Anyone got any questions? Yeah. Yes. The question is, were they afraid that he was going to destroy more pigs? I think they were just afraid that this man seemed to have strange powers. He was a Jew from across the water. They're not sure what he was going to do. He certainly cost the owners of the pigs a lot of money. He destroyed their livestock, and so on. So I think there is this, what is this? We don't know what to make of this guy. We don't know what he's going to do next. I think we should ask him to leave us. They couldn't quite wrap their heads around, what is this guy up to? Now, it's interesting that for them, they obviously, if you put it on a balanced scale, you put all the dead pigs on one side, and you put the restored lives of two individuals on the other side. To them, it didn't balance up. It's like when anyone ever says to you in an argument, look, it's not about the money, it's the principle of the thing. You can guarantee it's about the money. As soon as anyone ever says that to you, you know what is the real burr under their saddle is the money. But they say that because it sounds bad. Oh, it's not. Oh, don't mistake me. It's not about the money. I always smile at that point because it really is. Do you think how do you feel about that? Do you think that they were more focused on the money? Yeah. Does anyone tumble to the fact of why we're certain it wasn't Jewish territory? Because of the pigs. Yeah. The unclean animal which the Jews didn't eat. You say to a strict Jew today, would you have a bacon sandwich? That kind of thing. But I think it was the money was the aspect, and They were losing out. But also the business of they'd heard about this man. They didn't quite know what to make of him. They weren't sure what he would do next. Was he going to be a threat? Was it going to be a problem? What was he going to do in their community? And they would rather that he would go away. They would rather, okay, well, let's think about that, because we're hearing all kinds of stories. Think about it, most of the stories are going to be good. You're going to hear about this Jesus going around the villages and healing people and taking care of the sick and so on. Most of it they're going to hear very positively. But they've experienced this loss. You know, probably the leading pig farmer was the mayor of the town. Was the mayor of Gadara, and he's going, well, I don't think we want this guy around, Seems to be pig, what would you call pig genocide? I don't know. Pigside? Pigside? Swineside, okay, yeah. Yeah, just outside LA, Swineside, okay. Yeah, but I think that's the idea, that they're not sure what to make of Jesus, and he appears to be somewhat dangerous, edgy kind of person. You don't know what he's going to do next, that kind of thing. All right, thank you, everybody. We'll pick it up next week. Thank you so much.